Welcome to Democracy Differently, the podcast about why democracy isn't working and how to fix it. I'm joined by Eliot Higgins, the director of Bellingcat Investigative Collective, for a bonus episode on the recent killings of Alex Pretti and Renée by US federal agents. Eliot, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So first of all, can you tell us about Bellingcat? What does it do? How does it do it?
So Bellingcat is an organization that does open source investigation primarily, but we're also very heavily involved with education, creating resources for people to learn how to do open source investigation and spreading those ideas in general.
So let's talk about the Alex Pretti and the Renée killings to start with. So these cases aren't just about what happened, but about who gets to establish the truth when there's weak trust in institutions. How do you understand Bellingcat's role in that struggle over truth?
Well, I've started thinking about it in terms of how in this modern information environment, we have lots of different organizations, groups, individuals competing for attention. And when there's a high profile event like this, that kind of goes into overdrive. And what's kind of dominating a lot of that discourse is often what's coming from whichever institutions are responsible for the kind of the accountability around that. And in this case, obviously, it's been the Trump administration who aren't interested in accountability for what happened. And we knew from the Renée sheets they were more than willing to lie about the circumstances. So when it came to the most recent shooting, what we wanted to do is get out good information to the public as quickly as possible as that discourse was emerging and opinions were forming and hardening. So a really big part of what we were doing on the day was collecting videos, doing simple things like synchronizing them so you could see them from multiple angles at the same time, highlighting certain things that were becoming apparent to us it kind of in the moment rather than waiting to publish an article. But it did allow us then to do that analysis in real time in public and then eventually publish an article that brought all of that together as well. So from our perspective, it really helped inform the discourse as it was emerging on that day.
Yeah, so a lot of people will have seen the videos, will have seen the analysis, but is there anything in particular about your analysis of the videos, the details that you looked at that you would want to highlight? Any particular claims that were being made by the Trump administration that it allowed you to rule out, for example?
Well, I mean, one of the first claims is that the victim approached those officers with the intent to kill them. And from the videos, it was very clear that's not the case. He was filming them. He was directing some traffic that back and forth. The ICE officers approached a woman. He was nearby and pushed her over. He then reacted to that, and then he was tackled to the ground. The key moment was when one of the ICE agents removed the gun from him and other ICE agents started shouting, there's a gun, and then he was shot. But at that point, we can clearly see that he was disarmed. And that was, again, it's those kind of small moments that become really important because where usually the online debate starts that, oh, well, maybe he was, wasn't disarmed at the moment he was shot, or maybe he was reaching for his gun, and all those little things come up for discussion online, especially by those people who are trying to attack the individual, deny certain evidence and conclusions about what happened.
So we've seen a shift, let's say, in the rhetoric coming from the administration in the past couple of days, and that's been largely a result of this pushback. Do you think that the analysis by Bellingcat has directly influenced those decisions? For example, Gregory Bavino being taken out of Minneapolis, that's been directly influenced by the kind of piece by piece analysis of the video that you guys have done?
Well, part of our work is the investigation work, but we've also been involved with training a lot of the organizations who then publish their own analysis. So, for example, we've worked with the BBC and Washington Post to train them to do open source investigation, because part of this is not about making it about one organization and what they're saying, but spreading those skills, those methodologies as widely as possible through more traditional institutions, like the media, into the kind of public space as well. So people are equipped not only just to see stuff, but actually analyze it, distribute that, and inform the discourse that's happening online around this. And that's partly that's because we have to recognize that the information system we live in is very different from the 20th century information system, where the publics were really recipients of information from institutions, and it was done in a very kind of slow and selective way. Now we're in information spaces where there's a deluge of information, and everyone kind of filters their environment based off what their opinions are already.
Yeah.
So if you're someone who's pro-Trump, you'll see most of that information about what's happening coming from the pro-Trump accounts. But if you're in a kind of more neutral space, that's the opportunity to actually create good information in those spaces that inform the public, rather than leaving those vacuums that are then filled by bad information from bad actors.
So it's that neutral space that you're aiming at primarily.
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of ways of looking at this. I think of these spaces as really in competition by competing moral epistemic systems. So these are systems that create or understand how they create knowledge about the world through the morality of the group. So you can have a conspiratorial system where the group morality is really about not trusting institutions for a variety of reasons, and therefore that informs how they create knowledge about the world. You have populist systems where it's really about, it's the will of the people that's important. And you can see that in a kind of degenerative way where it's really about reinforcing groupthink and being loyal to a certain party, or a more regenerative version, which is about restoring kind of key functions of democracy, which I describe as verification, deliberation, and accountability, that you want justice and you want institutions to work properly so that justice can happen through those institutions. But it's still a populist movement because it is about the will of the people. Now, in terms of what Bellingcat is doing, I would see us more as a kind of extra institutional, functional democratic system where we're doing verification because we want to establish what the truth is. That feeds into deliberation at public level, at an institutional level, and that is also encouraging accountability at that level. And that is compatible with those populist systems that are regenerative because they're seeking the same thing. It's compatible with democratic institutions who still care about functional verification, deliberation, and accountability. And on the other side, you have populist systems, conspiratorial systems, and authoritarian systems that are not only compatible with each other, but they work extremely well in the current information environment because they offer a sense of belonging, a sense of kind of speed and velocity that's very important in the current information environment, and a sense of transparency, that you're kind of involved with the process if you want to be. That's especially true for conspiratorial systems. But because their form of verification is about reinforcing what people already believe, and deliberation is really about reinforcing the group identity, and accountability is always outward facing, and loyalty is for the in-group, that's actually a really degenerative form of democracy. So what we need to build as a kind of community that's interested in the more functional forms of democracy are those coalitions where not only are we doing the good work, but we're doing it quick enough to actually inform the discourse before it gets completely captured by those other systems.
This is a very big shift then. You're saying we're moving from a place where the people in charge of democracy actually value truth to some extent for its own sake, to a space where that's kind of irrelevant to them. And instead we have to speak to these neutral spaces where people still care about the truth and still willing to look at the kind of evidence that you're providing to try and counter that.
Well, it's not just that it's not that they don't care. It's just they don't understand the current system that they're in, because they still think they're in the 20th century system where, they have this top-down kind of media government dominated model, rather than one where institutions, the public and counter-publics, are competing for attention in the same space. And that skews the institutional response, because what's trending in those spaces, what's the algorithm is picking up are the things that get attention rather than things that are necessarily truthful. And certain topics, like, for example, the immigration debate, has a very high salience in that environment from both sides. It's not just about, what Nigel Farage or, Tommy Robinson is saying about it. It's the reaction to that as well, saying, aren't these people awful? Both of those get a lot of engagement on social media. Therefore, they're seen more. So institutions recognize that as a signal, that's what the public really cares about. But what's really happening is that what's is working well in that algorithmically mediated environment. And it's those populist logics that are the ones that are kind of fueling this. And that creates a skewed system where what makes people angry and upset is the highest priority, that good news and progress doesn't really get any, not notice because it isn't exciting or makes you angry or makes you click post or retweet.
Yeah. What's it like at a personal level being involved with this kind of research? Do you worry, for example, about personal safety?
Well, I mean, doing the open source investigation work on things like Russia, I mean, we've certainly had ongoing incidents of our staff being spied on, followed, cybersecurity attacks. We have to be aware of that. But my position is that this work is important. It makes a difference, and they wouldn't be so angry with us if it didn't do that. So some people have to do it, and we're the ones doing it. But also, these are skills, techniques, and methodologies that can be spread wide and far. It doesn't have to be about just one organization doing it. It can be about the whole network of organizations and institutional spaces and public spaces working on these ideas, just with those shared principles that are about functional forms of verification, deliberation, and accountability, rather than the more hollow forms that have kind of increasingly dominated democracy and shifted us towards the populist kind of simulated forms of it.
Yeah. Do you think this is a temporary place where Bellingcat and the organizations you're training need to use these methods to fill in? Or is this to counter these sort of more populist methods? Or do you think this is a long-term reconfiguration, and eventually we'll get to a point in democracy where we don't need external organizations to provide this truth because it'll be hardwired more into the way that democracy works?
Well, I think we can look at this in terms of counterpublics and how they formed in the 20th century. So these are movements that form in response to some injustice that is trying to pressure institutions and the public into recognizing that. So like the civil rights movement, for example. In this modern era, we have counterpublics that are forming around conspiratorial and populist ideas as well, which aren't about the functional forms of verification and everything else. It's about simulating them to give the impression that this is, a reaction that's democratic, but it really isn't. Yeah. Because conspiracy theories don't reject those principles; they just simulate them within their networks. The question is then, what is the role of counterpublics in this modern era where the information environment is so different? That all the publics, the counterpublics, and institutions exist in the same discourse space, and that's really about equipping those publics and counterpublics and institutions with the best tools possible to make a functional version of democracy that requires buy-in across society. That's not just about one organization like Bellingcat trying to fix things. We have to look at in terms of education, understanding that we live in an environment now where media literacy skills, critical thinking skills are essential because everyone participates in these information environments, not just as recipients of information, but creators and distributors of information as well. Even looking at a social media post slightly longer than other social media post on your feed informs an algorithm, which then provides information to other people who it thinks are just like you. We need to educate around those ideas, the idea of how these platforms capture our attention, how they capture our labor, that we are kind of almost serfs on the feudal land of these digital lords, that, you might be an influencer with 1 million followers versus someone with 100, but that's like being a serf with 100 pigs versus 1 pig. It still benefits the landowner. Ultimately, it captures people. And also it traps us in it because it then becomes very difficult to detach ourselves from these information environments because the traditional ones don't function in the way they did anymore. And to get the attention you need as a journalist, a politician, a activist, you have to be inside these spaces that are owned by these platforms. It's kind of like what we're seeing at the moment with so many politicians being too scared to leave X because they don't think they can build a similar following on other social media platforms, which is really what it comes down to. It's not a matter of freedom of speech, it's a matter of freedom of reach.
So it gives a huge amount of undemocratic power to the people that own the platforms.
Yeah, absolutely. And they can put their thumb on the scale, but we have to also understand that even without that, there are still dynamics there that shape behavior in a certain way. And it is behavior that, when it's algorithmically dominated, is about getting attention versus establishing the facts and truth. And we need to educate people around that. We need to start at primary level, not just wait until they take a media studies class at A level or something like that.
Yeah.
It's no longer that if you want to be involved with the media and informing public opinion, or, a politician, you take a certain route for your career. And then when you're 30, you might have a chance to do that. It's when you're 13 and you're picking up your phone and being engaged on social media, you're a part of something that is influencing other people. And it can't just be about, here's how you fact check headlines, kids, especially as kids don't read headlines anymore because they're getting video content rather than other content. It needs to be teaching those critical thinking skills that aren't focused on specific platforms, because that will change and evolve, but also looking at how you empower people to be part of the democratic processes, because that's what people are seeking. They're seeking that involvement. And that's what the populist and conspiratorial systems are offering them. They're saying you can be part of this movement. And the more democratic institutional moral epistemic systems don't adapt to that whatsoever. They're still trying to recreate the conditions of the 20th century, but those days are over.
So let me see if I've got you right. What you're saying is we're shifting from a model that's top down in new supply to a model that's bottom up, that's diffuse, that everyone participates in. And the populists have got that, and they're spinning narratives within that. In order to counter that, we need to find ways to get open source investigation, the kind of work you do, embedded, and more critical thinking embedded in just sort of people's everyday political interactions on social media and so on. Is that a fair summary of what you're...
Yeah, not just on social media though. We need to think about how this affects the kind of real world as well. That a part of our work at the moment at Bellingcat is working with universities to develop course material, then setting up investigative hubs. And long term, we want to connect them to local media, NGOs, and civil society actors. It's kind of like if you look over to the US at the moment, there is a lot of work being done to film on the ground, but where is that going? Who is kind of collecting that and analyzing that? Yeah. At the moment, Bellingcat is doing that. We are collecting, analyzing, preserving a lot of this material. But these are all tools and processes that can be taught in any city, any town in the US to local communities, local civil society actors and media and universities. So if you preemptively do that and get that training out there, then there's opportunities when these crises happen on the streets of American towns and cities that those communities can already respond in the way Bellingcat has been responding to get good information out into the environment as quickly as possible. And that creates not just, that's not about just creating a system, it's creating a set of moral values around what is important in terms of, building a better democracy. That if we just go down the populist route where it's just about, what you feel is what's true, then that's just going to always end up with a kind of authoritarian takeover.
Let's talk a bit about AI. We haven't mentioned that yet, but has that made your work a lot harder? How do you prove stuff when there's so much fakery around?
I mean, really, the biggest risk from AI at the moment isn't that it kind of tricks people into believing stuff that's not true. It's that it gives a permission structure to deny reality. That people can say, I mean, we see Donald Trump literally do this, that, oh, that video is fake, it's AI. And then that's the end of the conversation. Certainly, it creates extra sets of challenges for open source investigation, but they aren't insurmountable by any way. I mean, if you create a fake image from a incident, for example, it's possible to geolocate the real images and not AI generated ones. For example, with the Renée Good shooting, people had created an image of a different angle of the shooting with AI and were using that to justify the fact that the agent was going to be run over.
Yeah,
they were using AI to demask ICE agents, which is completely ridiculous and just doesn't work in the way they claim, or enhancing images of certain items or weapons, and then not really considering the AI was filling in gaps, not creating kind of valid information from that. Yeah. So that's also kind of part of the discourse now. But a lot of that, again, is about educating people about that, what's actually happening with this when you're using an AI system to create alternative angles and enhance stuff. It's not really doing what you're asking it to do. It's just filling in the gaps for you, which don't really exist in the first place.
Yeah, but you must rely to some extent on people wanting to get to that information. What if are people just sort of stopping at that excuse you gave that, oh, it must be a fake, or oh, that isn't a fake? Are they looking for the evidence in general? I mean, certainly some people are, but is there a worry that for a lot of people they're just not going to go digging, and whatever you say, it's not going to get heard?
Well, if you think back to the populist and conspiratorial and authoritarian systems, that's about really reinforcing what the group already believes. Yeah. So they will use these forms of doubt to deny what's real. There's kind of 4 different ways of doing this. There's doubting the evidence, for example. So you can say, oh, that's AI generated, or it's photoshopped. Doubting the claim about the evidence and saying, oh, well, that doesn't really show the thing that's happening. Doubting the process, and so on. So they weaponize those forms of doubt to deny reality. And you see this happening in lots of different communities who are kind of based around conspiratorial and populist ideas, because it is about reinforcing the group identity rather than actually establishing the truth. And that's what takes priority in these kind of incidents.
Yeah. What about in the future as AI gets more sophisticated? Is that going to make it harder and harder to tell the difference?
Well, it depends really. I mean, we've certainly seen improved video coming from AI, but again, nothing that I don't think we could kind of, check with geolocation or those traditional investigative techniques. We're also seeing, AI as a possible tool to help assist our work. We've been testing different large language models with geolocation because we've discovered because these large language models are trained on everything on the internet. It's also trained on all the guides and case studies we've published at Bellingcat. So you can ask it to geolocate something, and then it uses the kind of logic of Bellingcat to do that stuff. It's not always accurate, but it sometimes can actually be a surprisingly spot on with even quite obscure locations. So it's one way to kind of, reduce the amount of work you have to do to get that verification process done.
Great. So go back to open source investigation, and you said that this isn't just something that Bellingcat does, that it's training lots of other organizations. Do you think open source investigation has to be kept outside of government first and foremost? Or is it something that governments should be institutionalizing and doing more of themselves? Or does that put us in a dangerous situation where we're too dependent on government for truth?
Well, I think it's possible for organizations like Bellingcat to exist, and also governments and other stakeholders to do it independently of that. They don't have to interact with each other, but they're very useful skills, especially when trying to establish an understanding of events as they're unfolding very quickly. And we publish stuff online that anyone can go and read, and if you've got the skills to do open source investigation, you've got the skills to check other people's work. So, by having lots of independent organizations doing high quality investigation work using open sources, if the governments decide they want to use that information themselves, they need people who understand how to interpret that information, because there's certainly a lot of very bad open source investigation being done really just to support certain agendas and viewpoints rather than the more kind of functional version that we're doing.
Yeah. What have you learned about power from your work at Bellingcat?
I think in terms of kind of the traditional power structures of the 20th century, that they're adapting very poorly to the current information environment. They're being outcompeted in these new information spaces, and that they haven't really done much to adapt to that. They want to make tiny little tweaks to a system that is completely changed. It's been turned on its head.
And who's the they? Who's the they?
Well, I mean, for example, if you look at I was reading the Stratcom COE NATO's report on disinformation and what to do about it, and they were still very much focused on the idea that, this is all about foreign actors, and we just need to teach critical thinking skills and create good information to get rid of the bad information. But that's a very shallow and I think outdated reading that was very popular in the post 2016 kind of post Trump, post Brexit environment. But I think as over the last 10 years, people have kind of come to recognize that that was not the full story by any means, and really misinformation and disinformation are a symptom and a catalyst rather than the cause of the issues, and those causes are a lot deeper. That comes down to people losing trust in institutions for a variety of reasons, and some of that is legitimate. I mean, the invasion of Iraq in 2003 is very widely cited by a lot of people who say they don't trust the media or government. The financial crisis, where obviously lots of people lost their houses and the bankers still got their bonuses, and really over the last 20 years we've seen lots of situations like that. And I think also in parallel with that is a lot of Western governments have become more technocratic, that we have things like austerity because the maths say that we have to have it, and there's no real debate about that. So people feel they aren't part of the process, that a lot of public spaces have been hollowed out because market logic decides that having a community center isn't a good use of money. But it's like Thatcher saying there's no such thing as society. Actually, society is something we need a lot of in this current moment, because we're not just recipients of information, we're participants in its spreading creation, and that we need to understand that that has a responsibility that comes along with it.
Yeah. So if people are thinking democracy's in a crisis, the solution needs to come from the top. You're saying they've got it wrong. The solution is all about how we handle information at the level, at the general level, at the grassroots level. And the real fight is about verifying information, using these methods, checking for truth, just sort of in the way we interact with normal people, nothing to do with the big power structures that are much harder to directly shape.
Well, that's part of it, but we also need to make sure that goes somewhere. If we're all
Mhm.
fact checking and verifying and investigating, and then the institutions aren't responding to that, that's going to make people trust the institutions even less.
Yeah.
So institutions need to be very reactive to that. They need to understand that they aren't the dominant power structure anymore, that their power has been flattened into the public sphere, and that we need people who are able to institutions that are able to react when there is good information. And certainly with the work of Bellingcat, we've seen that happen. I mean, our work has been used in a variety of international courts, for example. It's been picked up by kind of traditional media and institutions and policy. So it can have that influence. But I think a big part of that is setting kind of those common standards in the kind of more epistemic terms about what is actually what we're trying to do here. And it is creating functional forms of verification and deliberation and accountability that work across the counterpublics, publics, and institutional spaces, and that institutions actually see that as something valuable they want to be part of rather than a threat to their power.
So in terms of those traditional institutions, the formalized institutions, is there one change that you could envisage to democratic institutions that would help them to deal better with the contested fact landscape that we're in?
Well, I don't think it even begins with changes. It begins with them even recognize the problem for what it is, because they really, really don't get it at the moment. Like I said before, I read the NATO Stratcom report about disinformation, and it was just very outdated ways of thinking about these problems that won't address any of the underlying issues. I think it's encouraging to see that the UK government has put out curriculum advice that focuses on building media literacy skills. Really, that should be critical thinking skills, and media literacy is part of that. But we also need to think about how we educate young people and adults as well about why democracy is valuable, how it should work, and then actually make sure it works in the way it's described to them as, because that's where people see the difference between a functional democracy and one that's performative or simulated.
So let's end on a hopeful note. I think, particularly in the wake of these killings, there's a lot of despair about the way democracy, particularly US democracy, is heading. Is that something that gives you hope that democracy will get beyond this moment and we have a hopeful future ahead of us?
Hope might be a bit of a strong word. I mean, I can certainly see a way out of it, but it takes a lot of effort. It requires a lot of people to be on board with it. It requires institutions to be responsive and actually take big steps rather than tiny tweaks to a system that doesn't actually work anymore. I've certainly found in my own work, people are open to these ideas, but it's actually putting them into practice and doing it quickly enough to make a difference. Because, say we have reform taking over the country in a few years' time, are they going to be the ones who are going to be implementing this kind of stuff? I seriously don't think they are. So we've got to get ourselves sorted out today rather than waiting for the next government or the next people to come along.
Great. Thank you, Eliot. It's been great to have you on the show.
That's great. Thanks.
Thanks. I hope you've enjoyed the podcast. If you have, please do remember to subscribe and follow us on social media. I've been your host, Keith. Thanks for tuning in.